It was supposed to be a proud milestone for 14-year-old Kayla Thompson, walking into Oak Bank in her school uniform to deposit a $5,000 academic scholarship check she earned through pure grit and brains. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. Instead of being treated with respect, Kayla was met with cold stares, suspicion, and outright humiliation. The bank manager, a woman named Victoria Hayes, questioned whether a young black girl could have rightfully earned such a check, and things spiraled from there. She was watched by security, isolated in a corner like a criminal, and forced to wait for hours. But here's the twist: while enduring this injustice, Kayla stumbled upon a secret meeting, Victoria passing confidential documents to a business rival of Kayla's mother. What was really going on? And how did a teenage girl turn the tables on a powerful institution? Stay with us to the end, you won't want to miss this. And don't forget to subscribe to Life's Hidden Gems and leave us a comment with your thoughts. Kayla Thompson stepped into Oak Bank with her shoulders squared and her mind focused. The morning air had been brisk, but she hadn't felt the chill. She was too busy feeling proud. At just 14 years old, she had earned a $5,000 academic scholarship to Westbrook Academy, one of the most prestigious prep schools in the state. That check wasn't just a slip of paper, it was a milestone. Proof that the late nights, the weekend study sessions, and the countless skipped parties had all been worth it. And today, she was going to deposit that check all on her own. She had dressed neatly in her navy school blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a pleated skirt that matched her academy's dress code. Her loafers clicked softly against the polished tile as she entered the bank's lobby. She clutched her leather folder close to her chest. Inside, the scholarship letter, her student ID, and the check. Everything was in perfect order. But perfection didn't matter when prejudice was already waiting. At the far end of the bank, Victoria Hayes looked up from her desk. Immaculately dressed in a beige designer suit, her posture stiff and her expression permanently sharp, Victoria's eyes narrowed as they landed on Kayla. There was a flicker, barely perceptible, but present. The kind of look that said, "You don't belong here." Kayla approached the teller counter, heart thudding but hand steady. She smiled at the young man behind the glass, Tom, his name tag read, and handed over her check and documents. Tom's eyebrows rose as he glanced at the check. $5,000, he muttered, holding it up to the light. Kayla nodded. "It's my academic scholarship. I brought everything with me." She offered her folder, showing him the official award letter from Westbrook Academy. But Tom didn't take it. He glanced behind him, then gestured subtly toward Victoria. A moment later, the manager herself strode over. Victoria didn't address Kayla. She didn't even look at her. "We've had a lot of fraudulent checks lately," she said, snatching the folder from Kayla's hands. "We'll need to verify everything. You'll have to wait." "I don't have my phone," Kayla said carefully. "I left it in my locker. May I call my mom?" Victoria's gaze barely flickered. "That's not our concern. You'll wait until we're done." With that, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the glass offices behind the counter. A security guard approached moments later. He didn't speak. Just stood beside Kayla like a silent wall, watching her. She was told to wait in the corner of the lobby. At first, Kayla stood calmly. She told herself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they really were just being cautious. But as the minutes ticked into hours, she began to see the pattern. An older white couple walked in with a check and were greeted warmly. Victoria herself stepped forward to usher them into a VIP room. 15 minutes later, a Hispanic man with thick paperwork and a gentle voice approached the counter. Victoria waved him off. "The system's running slow," she said, not even attempting to hide her impatience. Then another white couple entered. Victoria's entire demeanor changed. "Of course," she chirped. "Let me take care of that for you right away." Kayla's stomach tightened. Her arms crossed over her chest. It wasn't just bad service. It was something deeper. Her eyes flicked toward the oversized wall clock. She'd been standing there for nearly an hour. No one had updated her. No one had acknowledged her. People passed by, giving her the kind of look reserved for loiterers or troublemakers. Kayla was used to earning respect with her grades, her poise, her hard work. But here, none of that mattered. And then, something changed. Through the glass doors, a man walked in. He was tall, wearing an expensive charcoal gray suit and polished shoes. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Victoria practically floated toward him. Kayla didn't know who he was, at first. But when she saw the way Victoria bent toward him, whispering, handing him a manila folder marked, "Confidential," something clicked. Her mother, Dr. Naomi Thompson, had once mentioned a man named Harrison Wells in passing. CEO of Meridian Banking Group. Ruthless. Competitive. Dangerous. And now, here he was. Victoria leaned in, murmuring something into his ear. She handed him the folder, her expression far too eager, her tone hushed and conspiratorial. Kayla shifted subtly, keeping her face turned down but her ears alert. She couldn't hear much, but what she saw told her everything. She opened her notebook. The one she always carried for homework and ideas. With shaking hands, she began writing. 1:27 p.m. Victoria Hayes handed confidential folder to Harrison Wells. No log, no sign-in. Smiling. Whispering. Possibly a legal transaction. She wrote down names. Descriptions. Every snippet she could gather without drawing attention. Minutes later, Wells walked out. Victoria returned to the counter, her expression stony again. But when her eyes met Kayla's, something flickered, almost like fear. Or guilt. Kayla stood a little taller. She had no idea what exactly she just witnessed, but she knew it mattered. And then the glass doors opened again. Her mother stepped inside. Naomi Thompson didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make a scene. Her presence alone silenced the lobby. Every head turned. She moved straight toward Kayla, her expression darkening as she took in the sight of her daughter standing alone, still flanked by the security guard. "Kayla," she said, voice calm but cutting through the room like a bell, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," Kayla replied. "But you need to see this." She handed her notebook to her mother, open to the page she had filled with notes. As Naomi read, her eyes sharpened. She turned slowly toward Victoria. "Miss Hayes," she said, her voice low and unwavering, "you owe my daughter an apology. And I believe you owe me an explanation." Victoria blinked. "Excuse me. You handed confidential documents to Harrison Wells. I know who he is. I also know what he's after. And now, thanks to your carelessness and your prejudice, I have the proof." The room froze. "You're fired," Naomi said. "Effective immediately." The security guard who had watched Kayla without a word now stepped toward Victoria. "Please escort her out." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came. She turned, pale and silent, and walked toward the door. Naomi faced the lobby. "This bank will undergo a full investigation," she announced. "There will be changes. No one should be treated the way my daughter was today. Not here. Not anywhere." In the weeks that followed, the story spread. Oaked Bank initiated a full leadership overhaul. Victoria's actions were confirmed, she had been leaking data to a competitor. Several employees admitted they'd seen it, but had been too afraid to speak up. That silence would not return. Melody Tran, a junior teller who had offered Kayla a kind word during the ordeal, was promoted to assistant manager. Naomi implemented mandatory equity training across all branches. Customers noticed the change. And Kayla? She was invited to speak at Westbrook Academy. She stood in front of a packed auditorium, peers, parents, teachers, and told her story. Not just the pain, but the strength, the lesson, and the power of speaking up. She ended with a message she would carry with her for the rest of her life. You can silence someone for a moment. But truth finds a way. In the days that followed the dramatic confrontation at Oak Bank, the story of Kayla Thompson's experience spread rapidly. First, it was whispered about in local PTA meetings and school parking lots. Then came a viral social media post, shared by one of the customers who had witnessed Naomi Thompson's unwavering stance and the public firing of Victoria Hayes. Within 48 hours, the post had over 100,000 shares. People weren't just reacting to the injustice, they were inspired by how a young girl and her mother had stood up for what was right in the face of prejudice and betrayal. But behind the headlines and praise, Kayla remained grounded. She still had homework due, quizzes to study for, and her morning routines to follow. Yet, something inside her had shifted. The experience at the bank hadn't just humiliated her, it had awakened her. The same confidence that led her to walk into the bank alone that morning had now evolved into something deeper, a sense of purpose. At school, classmates approached her differently. Some offered quiet words of encouragement, others asked questions with genuine curiosity. A few even apologized for things they hadn't done but now saw in a new light. Westbrook Academy was a place of excellence, but it had never been immune to the subtle social divides that mirrored the outside world. One afternoon, while Kayla was studying in the library, her civics teacher, Mrs. Langston, approached her with an unexpected proposition. I read the full article in the Times, she said, placing a hand gently on Kayla's shoulder. And I watched the clip of your mother confronting the bank manager. You held yourself with such strength. I think our 8th grade assembly would benefit from hearing your perspective. Would you be willing to speak? Kayla hesitated. Speaking in front of a full auditorium? It wasn't something she'd planned for. But then she thought of the people in the bank lobby, those who had seen her suffering and said nothing. If her voice could move others to see, to think, to act, then yes. It was worth it. The day of the assembly arrived. Students filed into the auditorium, teachers took their seats, and a gentle buzz of conversation filled the air. When Kayla stepped onto the stage, the room quieted. She stood behind the wooden podium, her notes in hand, her heart racing. She took a deep breath. I'm not here to talk about just one bad day, she began. I'm here to talk about the reality some of us live every day, and how important it is to notice it, name it, and change it. For the next 15 minutes, Kayla recounted what had happened at Oak Bank. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. The suspicion. The silence. The folder passed in secrecy. The humiliation of being watched like a thief while others were welcomed like guests. She ended with the moment her mother walked in and stood beside her. She reminded me that being silent when you're being wronged isn't strength. But neither is screaming in anger. Real strength, Kayla said, looking out across the crowd, is standing tall and speaking truth, even if your voice shakes. The auditorium erupted into applause. Some students stood. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Mrs. Langston hugged her tightly afterward and said, "You just opened a lot of eyes today." That assembly marked the beginning of something larger. Dr. Naomi Thompson, already respected in the financial world, was soon invited to speak at industry panels about ethical leadership and corporate accountability. She always made sure to highlight what had happened to Kayla, not to gain sympathy, but to point out how embedded bias could quietly infect even the most professional environments. Meanwhile, Oak Bank underwent serious internal changes. The board launched an independent audit of customer service patterns. Security camera footage was reviewed. Interviews were conducted with every employee. What emerged was a disturbing pattern: customers of color, particularly young ones, had been systematically profiled, delayed, and sometimes denied services altogether. It hadn't just happened to Kayla. In response, Naomi proposed a comprehensive training program for all branches. But it wasn't the typical one-day workshop with corporate buzzwords. This was a multi-week course designed by behavioral psychologists and civil rights educators. It included role-playing scenarios, anonymous surveys, and real-time customer feedback. Melody Tran, now promoted to assistant branch manager, became a quiet force of change within the building. She pushed for small but meaningful adjustments, adding welcome signs in multiple languages, ensuring all staff greeted each customer, and installing a direct hotline for client complaints. Under her guidance, the branch atmosphere shifted from cold formality to genuine attentiveness. One Friday afternoon, several weeks after the incident, Kayla returned to the bank, this time with her mother, not to confront, but to observe. "Are you sure you're ready?" Naomi asked gently as they stepped into the lobby. Kayla nodded. "I need to see it." The atmosphere was strikingly different. A black couple in their 60s sat at a desk speaking with a banker who laughed warmly with them. A young woman wearing a hijab was being helped at the counter without so much as a second glance. Even the security guard smiled and nodded as Kayla and Naomi entered. Melody came out to greet them personally. "I've been waiting for the chance to see you again," she said, her smile warm. "We have a lot to thank you for." Kayla shook her hand. "No one should have to go through what I did. But I'm glad it helped change things." Melody led them to her office and showed them a wall where new core values had been posted: respect, accountability, fairness, trust. Kayla stared at them for a moment, then smiled. "It's a start." Back at Westbrook Academy, her impact continued to grow. The head of school invited her to join a newly formed Diversity and Equity Student Council. Kayla found herself surrounded by students from different grades and backgrounds, some who had never spoken up before, but now felt empowered to share their experiences. Together, they initiated First Look Friday, a weekly open mic series where students could talk about moments of bias, struggle, or resilience they'd faced. Kayla hosted the first event, where she read a poem she'd written in the days after the bank incident. "I stood in a room made of marble and glass, treated like shadows that quietly pass. But I am not air. I am not doubt. My name is strength. I will speak out." Her words echoed long after the mic was passed. In time, Kayla began receiving letters, some handwritten, others emailed, from students in other states who had heard her story through reposted videos and articles. Some shared their own experiences of being dismissed or profiled. Others simply said, "You helped me feel seen." She responded to every letter she could. Her mother helped her set up a P.O. box just to handle the volume. They created a blog together where she shared resources on financial literacy for teens, how to handle discrimination in professional spaces, and how to advocate for change respectfully and effectively. By the end of the school year, Kayla Thompson was no longer just the girl from the bank story. She was a student leader, a young writer, an advocate for fairness. And she remained, above all, a kid who had simply wanted to deposit a check, and found herself changing a system. The last time she and Naomi drove past Oak Bank before summer break, Kayla looked out the window quietly. "You know," she said, "if that had gone smoothly, I would have been in and out in 15 minutes. Naomi chuckled softly. "And you never would have known what was broken inside." Kayla nodded. "But now it's not just about fixing it for me. It's about making sure no one else gets treated like that again." Naomi glanced over with pride. "That's leadership, Kayla." The road stretched ahead, summer sun glinting through the windshield. And though she was only 14, Kayla knew this was only the beginning of what she was meant to do. After the emotional assembly at Westbrook Academy, Kayla Thompson returned to her usual routine, but something inside her had changed. Standing before her peers, sharing her experience at Oak Bank, had shifted her understanding of what it meant to be heard. It was no longer just about telling her story, it was about giving others the courage to tell theirs. That day, she had seen a ripple effect. students came up to her afterward with stories of their own, some about being followed in stores, others about being silenced in classrooms or treated differently in extracurricular programs. Kayla realized she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she had the tools to do something about it. At home, Naomi noticed the shift too. Her daughter had always been focused and responsible, but now she carried herself with a deeper sense of purpose. She spent evenings updating her blog, responding to messages from students around the country, and sketching out ideas in her notebook about how to reach more people, especially those who didn't have access to the same resources she did. One night after dinner, Kayla approached her mother in the kitchen. Naomi was finishing up emails for a board meeting the next morning, but she immediately closed her laptop when she saw Kayla standing there, notebook in hand. "Mom, I've been thinking," Kayla began. "That check, it wasn't just about the money. It was about what it symbolized: opportunity, access, dignity. And the way they treated me, it wasn't just wrong, it was common. What happened to me happens to kids all over this country." Naomi nodded. "You're right." Kayla flipped open her notebook. "So what if we started something? A real program. Something to help students understand their rights, how to handle situations like this, and how to stand up without getting shut down." Naomi leaned in, intrigued. "Tell me more." Kayla laid out her idea for what would eventually become the foundation of the First Voice initiative. She envisioned a youth-led program focused on equipping students with knowledge about financial literacy, personal advocacy, and navigating systems, banks, schools, workplaces, that too often treated young people, especially minorities, with suspicion or indifference. "I want to teach them how to prepare for the moments no one prepares you for," Kayla said. "The moments where your integrity is questioned before you even speak." Naomi listened carefully, her pride growing with each word. "That's more than a program," she said. "That's a movement." They started small. Kayla's first step was creating a series of blog posts called "Your Voice, Your Power," which quickly gained traction online. Students shared the posts in group chats and on social media. Teachers began printing them out and handing them to students during advisory periods. Each post tackled a different topic, from how to open a bank account to how to respond when you're unfairly treated by authority figures. But the digital space wasn't enough. One afternoon, Kayla received an email from a middle school counselor in a neighboring city. "I have a student," the counselor wrote, "who reminds me a lot of you. She tried to cash a babysitting check at a local bank, and the teller called her parents to verify it. She's been embarrassed ever since. Would you consider speaking to our 8th grade leadership club?" Kayla read the email 3 times, her heart pounding. It was the first time someone had asked her to share her voice in person since the school assembly. She turned to Naomi. "I want to go." They drove out to the middle school that Friday. When Kayla entered the classroom, she was met by 30 curious faces, all seated in plastic chairs, notebooks in hand. The room fell silent. "Hi," Kayla said softly. "I'm Kayla. And I know what it feels like to be seen as suspicious before you even speak." That was all it took. For the next hour, she shared her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had taken back control of the narrative. She didn't focus on blame. She focused on awareness, preparation, and the importance of knowing your worth. The students listened intently, some nodding, others writing furiously. At the end, a girl raised her hand. "What do you do when adults won't believe you?" Kayla smiled gently. "You document. You stay calm. You tell your truth anyway. Because their disbelief says more about them than it does about you." After the session, students lined up to talk to her. Some shared their own experiences. Others simply asked for advice. When Kayla walked out of the building, she turned to Naomi. "This is what I'm supposed to be doing." Over the next month, Kayla spoke at 3 more schools. She began adapting her blog content into a student-friendly toolkit. Naomi helped with editing and formatting, and by November, they had a polished 20-page guide titled Standing Strong, A Student's Guide to Everyday Advocacy. It included role-play scenarios, journaling prompts, basic legal vocabulary, and steps on how to report inappropriate treatment. Kayla and Naomi printed 500 copies using their own savings. They distributed them to schools, libraries, and youth centers across the county. One guidance counselor called the guide a lifeline for students who've never been taught they're allowed to speak up. Meanwhile, word about Kayla's work continued to spread. A popular education podcast invited her on for an episode titled Too Young to be Ignored. During the interview, Kayla emphasized that while her experience at Oak Bank was painful, it gave her something valuable, a platform. "The goal isn't to stay angry," she said. "The goal is to turn what hurt us into something that heals others." The interview went viral. Soon after, Kayla was invited to join the State Student Advocacy Council, a body that advised the Department of Education on student needs. She was the youngest member ever appointed. At her first meeting, she proposed that all schools include a basic advocacy and financial awareness module for middle schoolers. There are 13-year-olds applying for jobs, opening accounts, and signing up for programs, she argued. But no one's teaching them how to navigate those systems. That's a setup for failure. The council voted unanimously to pilot her proposal in 10 districts. At the same time, Kayla continued her schoolwork. She still aced her algebra tests, still worked on her science fair project, and still made time to read mystery novels on weekends. But her life now included policy meetings, interviews, and workshops. And through it all, Naomi remained her steady guide, supportive, protective, but always pushing her to think deeper. One evening in December, as snow lightly dusted the streets outside, Kayla sat by the fireplace updating her blog. She had just returned from a speaking engagement at a youth summit where she met dozens of teens with similar stories, some more heartbreaking than hers. One boy from rural Alabama had been denied service at a convenience store because the clerk assumed his prepaid debit card was stolen. A girl from Arizona had been accused of cheating because she used too advanced vocabulary in a scholarship essay. Kayla's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she tried to process it all. Then she began to type. Our experiences are different, but the thread is the same: disbelief, dismissal, disrespect. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that our voices are stronger together. If they won't open the doors, we'll build new ones. She posted the entry and closed her laptop. Later that night, as Naomi tucked a blanket over Kayla's shoulders, she asked, "Do you ever wish none of this had happened? That the bank just treated you like everyone else that day?" Kayla paused before answering. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But if they had, I wouldn't have seen what so many others go through. I wouldn't have known how broken the system was. And I wouldn't have found my purpose." Naomi leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then maybe it wasn't a setback. Maybe it was your beginning." As winter break approached, Kayla began planning a youth summit of her own. She wanted to bring together students from across the state, different backgrounds, different experiences, with one shared goal: to be heard, to be seen, and to be prepared. She didn't have a budget yet, or a venue, or even a full program outline. But she had momentum. She had allies. And most importantly, she had a voice that could no longer be ignored. What started with a scholarship check had become a revolution of awareness, resilience, and action. Kayla Thompson wasn't just building confidence in others, she was building a new culture, one student at a time. The summer after Kayla Thompson's experience at Oak Bank was anything but ordinary. While many of her classmates traveled, attended summer camps, or simply relaxed, Kayla found herself thrust into a new kind of responsibility. Her story had not only sparked changes at the bank and her school, but it had opened doors to a wider world of advocacy, one she hadn't expected but now felt called to explore. The Thompson home, nestled in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, had become a center of activity. Journalists requested interviews. Local leaders invited Kayla to speak at town halls. Even a few national platforms reached out, offering her the opportunity to share her story on broader stages. Naomi, always protective but never controlling, carefully vetted each invitation. She made sure her daughter's voice remained authentic and that her well-being came first. One late afternoon in July, Kayla sat on the back porch with a glass of lemonade in her hand, her notebook balanced on her knee. She'd been drafting a speech for an upcoming youth equity conference in Chicago. The theme was Power and Truth, and the organizers had specifically requested Kayla to be one of the keynote speakers. It would be her first time addressing an audience beyond her state. Though nervous, she was determined to speak not just about what had happened to her, but about what it meant. Naomi joined her outside, carrying a folder of printed emails. "More letters came today," she said, handing the folder to her daughter. Kayla flipped through them, her eyes scanning handwritten notes from students, parents, and even bank employees from across the country. One letter stood out. A woman named Diane from Ohio wrote, "My daughter saw your speech on YouTube. She's 13. She told me, that girl stood up when no one else would. I want to be like her. Thank you, Kayla, for giving her someone real to look up to." Kayla pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes for a moment. This was why she had to keep going. It was no longer just about her story, it was about the ripple effects. In early August, she and Naomi traveled to Chicago for the conference. The energy in the city was electric, buzzing with voices from across the nation, students, educators, community organizers, all gathered to discuss justice, opportunity, and youth empowerment. Kayla sat on a panel with 3 other young advocates, all of whom had their own powerful stories. One had led a walkout after facing discrimination at school, another had developed an app to report bias in public spaces. When it was Kayla's turn to speak, she stepped up to the podium with steady hands. "I came here today not as someone who sought attention, but as someone who stumbled into it by simply trying to do the right thing," she began. "I walked into a bank to deposit a scholarship check, and I walked out knowing I had to fight for more than just financial recognition. I had to fight for dignity." She told the full story, from the way Victoria Hayes looked at her, to the quiet shame of standing alone in the lobby, to the moment her mother walked in and shifted the entire room. She shared the details others had ignored, the dismissive tones, the security guard's silence, the whispered exchanges with a rival CEO. She didn't dramatize. She didn't accuse. She told the truth. "I realized something that day," Kayla said. "Sometimes, people don't want to see you. Not because you've done something wrong, but because seeing you means they have to acknowledge the systems that have failed you. And themselves." The audience gave her a standing ovation. Back home, things continued to evolve. Naomi's leadership in the banking world reached new heights. She was asked to chair a national initiative aimed at ethical reforms in financial institutions, and she accepted, with one condition: youth representation would be part of every stage. She knew firsthand the power of a young voice. Kayla, meanwhile, launched a blog titled, More Than a Number, aimed at young people of color navigating professional environments for the first time: banks, job interviews, internships. She wrote about how to identify bias, how to document experiences, and how to find allies in systems not designed for them. Each post included a resource list and a message of encouragement. The blog gained traction quickly, picked up by educators and youth counselors nationwide. In September, Kayla received a surprising invitation from the National Bankers Association. They were hosting an annual leadership summit in Washington, D.C., and wanted her to serve as a youth advisor on a panel discussing racial bias in customer service. Naomi was hesitant at first. It was a high-pressure setting filled with powerful figures. But Kayla didn't hesitate. "I don't need to be the smartest person in the room," she told her mom. "I just need to be the one who refuses to stay quiet." At the summit, executives and regulators from across the country listened as Kayla recounted her experience again, but this time with emphasis on the systemic nature of what happened. She described how policy could be weaponized as a shield for discrimination, and how unchecked authority in customer-facing roles could shape the financial futures of entire families. One moment stood out above the rest. A senior executive from a major national bank, someone who had been notably stoic during the discussion, stood and asked, "What would you have us do differently?" Kayla paused for a moment, then replied, "Start by believing that young people, especially young people of color, belong in your spaces. Not just as customers, but as future leaders. When you treat us with suspicion instead of respect, you don't just hurt us, you rob yourself of the trust that sustains your institution." The applause was thunderous. By the time Kayla returned to Westbrook Academy that fall, the entire campus felt different. A mural had been commissioned in the main hallway, vibrant colors forming the faces of student leaders, Kayla among them. The school's student government revised their constitution to include a permanent diversity council seat. And Kayla, now in 9th grade, was elected to represent her class. Despite the growth and praise, Kayla remained the same focused, grounded girl she had always been. She still made time for tutoring others in algebra, still packed her own lunch every morning, still took long walks with her mom on Sunday evenings. But now, she walked with greater purpose. One evening in October, Naomi sat beside her daughter at the kitchen table, looking through old photos for a school project. She stopped at one, a snapshot of a younger Kayla, no more than 10 years old, holding a handmade sign that read, "Speak Up." "Even back then," Naomi said softly, "you knew who you were." Kayla smiled. "Back then, I just didn't know how loud my voice could be." Naomi looked at her daughter with deep pride. "And now the world hears it." Later that night, Kayla updated her blog with a new post titled "The Power of Being Seen." She wrote, "Sometimes the greatest change starts when someone sees you, not as a problem, but as a person. And sometimes, you have to be the one to show the world how to see you. That's what I did. That's what I'll keep doing." She clicked publish, closed her laptop, and looked out the window at the stars above. In a world that once tried to ignore her, Kayla Thompson had become impossible to overlook. By the time winter rolled around, Kayla Thompson had become a recognizable name in households far beyond her quiet neighborhood in Oak Ridge. Her story was now taught in high school social studies classes as a modern case study on institutional bias and youth advocacy. But even as attention mounted, Kayla remained focused on the deeper work. For her, this wasn't about headlines. It was about impact, real, lasting change in places where silence had once reigned. Despite her rising profile, Kayla stayed grounded in her routines. She still helped her mom cook dinner most evenings, still studied diligently for her biology quizzes, and still went to church every Sunday. But now, alongside her schoolbooks, she carried a new responsibility, shaping a future where young people of color wouldn't have to endure what she had. One evening, Naomi sat Kayla down in the living room with a serious expression. "I've been contacted by the state attorney general's office," Naomi said, handing Kayla a letter printed on crisp, official stationery. "They're opening a broader investigation into discriminatory banking practices in our state, and they want to include your case as part of the formal inquiry." Kayla stared at the letter, letting the words sink in. Her experience at Oak Bank wasn't going to just live in memories or blog posts, it was going to serve as a catalyst for legal reform. "I want to do it," she said, her voice steady. "But only if they're serious about real change. I don't want to be part of something that just checks a box." "They are," Naomi said with conviction. "They've already subpoenaed internal documents from the bank. And your notes, Kayla, your notebook, it's being considered key evidence." Kayla nodded slowly. That battered leather-bound notebook she had clutched so tightly in the bank that day, filled with time stamps, names, descriptions, had become a piece of history. In January, the public hearings began. Held in a historic courthouse downtown, the hearings brought together bank executives, civil rights lawyers, community activists, and citizens who had quietly endured discrimination for years. The courtroom was a mix of polished suits and working-class families, united by a shared mission. Kayla was scheduled to testify on the third day. When she took the stand, the room quieted. Dressed in a gray blazer and black slacks, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, she looked calm, but beneath the surface, her heart pounded. She clutched her notebook as if it were a shield. The lead investigator, a thoughtful man named Mr. Delgado, began the questioning. "Miss Thompson, can you recount, in your own words, what happened at Oak Bank that day?" Kayla took a deep breath and told the story again, this time for the official record. She described the way Victoria Hayes had looked through her, the way security had followed her, the way no one had spoken up as she stood for hours, humiliated. Then she recounted the confidential exchange between Victoria and Harrison Wells, her decision to document it, and her mother's eventual intervention. "Why did you start taking notes?" Delgado asked. "Because no one believed me at first," Kayla replied. "And I realized if I wanted people to see what was happening, I had to prove it." There was a pause. Then Delgado asked, "What would you say to those who claim what happened was just a misunderstanding? Just following protocol?" Kayla didn't flinch. "I'd ask them how many misunderstandings only happen to kids who look like me. Because that day, everyone else was treated like they belonged. I was treated like a threat." The courtroom was silent. After her testimony, Kayla stepped down and returned to her seat next to Naomi. Dozens of people in the audience nodded in respect. A few even stood and applauded quietly, despite courtroom decorum. Over the following weeks, dozens of similar stories emerged, some eerily like Kayla's, others even more egregious. An elderly black veteran denied a loan without explanation. A Latina business owner asked for excessive documentation. A high school student like Kayla, accused of presenting a forged check, later confirmed to be genuine. The evidence piled up. As the investigation progressed, Harrison Wells came under legal scrutiny for his role in receiving stolen proprietary information from Victoria Hayes. Under pressure, he stepped down from his role at Meridian Banking Group. Victoria, who had initially denied all wrongdoing, eventually confessed to her actions during a closed-door deposition. Facing mounting legal pressure, she agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Meanwhile, Oak Bank issued a public statement acknowledging its institutional failures and pledged to implement a sweeping reform package. Naomi was asked to lead the oversight committee, and she accepted, on the condition that Kayla be appointed a youth advisor on the team. On a brisk February morning, Kayla sat in a conference room on the top floor of Oak Bank's headquarters. Around the table sat board members, legal counsel, HR executives, and 2 community advocates. At the head of the table sat Naomi, confident and composed. "Today," Naomi began, "we're not here to protect reputations. We're here to protect people." Kayla added, "And that starts by listening. Really listening." The committee went on to review proposed changes that included blind application processes for loan reviews, standardized customer service checklists to eliminate discretion-based disparities, a diversity-first hiring initiative, and a public reporting dashboard on customer satisfaction and complaints. It was the kind of reform that institutions had long avoided. But now, the pressure was real, and the leadership finally understood the cost of silence. Outside the boardroom, Kayla's influence continued to ripple. Her blog now had over 200,000 subscribers. Educators began using her posts in middle and high school curricula. She was featured on a PBS special highlighting young changemakers in America. And yet, Kayla still insisted on being home for dinner by 6:30, still tutored younger students at her local library, and still woke up at 6 a.m. to walk the family dog. One Sunday afternoon, after church, she and Naomi visited the old bank branch where it had all begun. The branch had been renovated, brighter lighting, more seating, a wall of community portraits featuring local leaders, including Kayla herself. Melody Tran, now the branch manager, greeted them with a proud smile. "Every time a young customer walks through these doors," Melody said, "I think of that day. And I make sure they know they're valued." Kayla walked past the old corner where she had stood alone for hours. It no longer looked the same. There was a bench there now. A shelf with free financial literacy booklets for teens. A small framed quote on the wall read, "When one voice rises, it echoes beyond the room." Kayla Thompson. She touched the edge of the frame gently. "Still feels a little surreal," she said. Naomi smiled. "You changed more than a room, Kayla. You changed a system." As spring approached, Kayla began thinking about what came next. High school was just beginning. College applications were still years away. But in her heart, she already knew the path she wanted to walk. Advocacy wasn't just something she did, it was part of who she was. She applied for a spot in the youth legal literacy program at a nearby university, eager to study policy and justice. She started mentoring younger girls in her neighborhood, helping them navigate school, finances, and friendships. And she began outlining her first book, a memoir, part personal reflection, part guidebook for young people seeking to stand up and be heard. But through it all, she remained the same Kayla. The girl who walked into a bank to deposit a scholarship check and walked out with the power to inspire a nation. Her story wasn't just a headline or a hashtag. It was a blueprint. And she was just getting started. By the time Kayla Thompson entered the spring semester of her freshman year, she had become more than just a name tied to a civil rights case. She was a living example of how courage, when met with conviction, could shake even the most unyielding institutions. But as her journey evolved, so did the depth of her impact. No longer content with simply being a symbol, Kayla began to explore the idea of long-term solutions, ways to educate, empower, and elevate others like her. One Saturday morning in April, Kayla sat at the dining room table with her mother, Naomi Thompson, reviewing a series of proposals they'd received from nonprofit organizations and youth programs. Since the conclusion of the state investigation into Oak Bank and the formal implementation of systemic reforms, a new wave of interest had poured in. Schools wanted curriculum kits. Financial institutions were seeking guidance on inclusion. Colleges had begun offering early mentorship to students who were changing their communities. "Mom," Kayla said, flipping through one of the binders, "what if we created our own program?" Naomi looked up from her coffee. "What do you mean?" "A program led by young people," Kayla continued, "for young people. Where we teach financial literacy, but also how to recognize bias, how to document experiences, and how to advocate for yourself. Not just after something happens, but before it ever does." Naomi leaned back in her chair, proud and intrigued. "What would you call it?" Kayla smiled. "The First Voice Initiative." That weekend, mother and daughter began laying the groundwork. They started with a mission statement, to equip youth, especially those from underrepresented communities, with the tools and confidence to navigate professional spaces with dignity and purpose. They drafted outlines for workshops, webinars, and school partnerships. Naomi brought her financial expertise, Kayla brought her first-hand experience and insight into what her generation needed. By May, the First Voice Initiative had its first pilot program, a 4-week workshop series hosted at the Oak Ridge Community Center. The turnout was far greater than expected. Students ages 13 to 18 filled the room, notebooks in hand, eyes focused, eager to learn from someone their own age who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. Kayla's first session began with a simple question: how many of you have ever felt like you didn't belong in a place where you had every right to be? Nearly every hand went up. From there, the program blossomed. Kayla spoke about her own experience at Oak Bank, not as a victim, but as a strategist. She walked students through how she had documented events, how she had stayed composed under pressure, and how her calm strength helped validate her truth when the time came. The curriculum blended real-world skill building, how to read contracts, open accounts, build credit, with social tools like how to file a complaint, how to recognize coded language, and how to speak truth to power respectfully and effectively. After the 4th session, one girl named Mia approached Kayla with tears in her eyes. "I thought I was the only one," she said. "But now I know I'm not crazy. That what I felt, That coldness, that suspicion, it's real. And I can do something about it. Kayla hugged her tightly. That was the moment she knew the First Voice initiative wasn't just a program. It was a movement. By the end of the school year, Kayla had presented the program at 3 public high schools, 1 church youth group, and a regional student leadership conference. The feedback was overwhelming. Parents praised its depth. Students called it life-changing. Teachers asked how they could integrate it into their curriculums. It wasn't long before national organizations came knocking. In early June, Kayla received a formal invitation to the National Youth Policy Summit in Washington, D.C., where she would be asked to speak on a panel titled Redefining Leadership, the Next Generation of Change Agents. She was the youngest panelist by nearly 5 years. The event took place at the historic Mayflower Hotel, a space once used for presidential press conferences and foreign diplomacy. Kayla arrived in a tailored navy dress and low heels, her notebook still by her side. As she waited backstage, she overheard a conversation between 2 organizers. "She's the one who exposed that banking manager, right?" "Yes, and she started a financial literacy program, at 14. Unbelievable. We're witnessing the beginning of something big." When Kayla stepped onto the stage, she was calm and collected. She looked out into the room, filled with lawmakers, educators, and business leaders, and spoke not with hesitation, but with authority. "I didn't choose to become an activist," she began. "But I chose not to stay silent. And I believe that's where leadership begins." She spoke about the necessity of empowering youth, not just as voices to be heard, but as minds to be trusted. She described how institutions often talked about diversity and inclusion without ever truly relinquishing control or listening to those most affected. She offered actionable steps, creating youth advisory boards, mandating bias training with lived experience testimonials, and making financial literacy a core part of early education. After the event, Kayla was approached by Senator Miriam Clark, a well-respected figure who chaired the Senate Committee on Education and Youth Empowerment. "I've been following your journey," Senator Clark said. "I believe your voice belongs not just in community centers, but in policy discussions. I'd like to invite you to serve as a student advisor to our Youth Empowerment Task Force." Kayla's heart skipped. "I'd be honored." Over the summer, while other students were attending beach camps and amusement parks, Kayla was traveling between state offices and Zoom calls, helping shape real legislation. She reviewed proposed laws on equitable education access, wrote testimonials, and even sat in on budget planning meetings related to youth support funding. Her favorite project came in July, when she helped launch a state-funded initiative to provide free financial literacy toolkits to every 8th grader in the public school system. Each kit included a planner, workbook, glossary of terms, and a pocket guide titled Know Your Rights, Speaking Up Without Backing Down, which Kayla helped author. At the same time, she didn't let go of her normal life. She still met her friends for movie nights. She still volunteered at the library. She still snuck ice cream into the house despite Naomi's low-sugar rule. Fame had never been the goal, and she was careful not to let it distract her from the values that shaped her from the beginning. One evening in August, Kayla and Naomi sat on their porch under the stars. It had been a whirlwind year. A journey that started with a simple check deposit had become a mission that touched thousands. Naomi turned to her daughter. "You've done more in a year than most adults do in a decade." Kayla smiled. "But we're just getting started, right?" Naomi nodded. "Right. And I'll be with you every step of the way." That night, Kayla opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "A system can only ignore your voice until you learn how to project it louder than their silence." She didn't know exactly where this path would take her, law school, perhaps, or policy work, but she knew who she was now. Not just a girl who had once been ignored, but a young woman who had learned to build platforms where no one would ever be ignored again. And in every bank, every classroom, every boardroom she entered from that point forward, she carried with her the quiet but unwavering power of that first stand. The power of the first voice. As autumn settled into Oak Ridge, Kayla Thompson's life had become a whirlwind of purpose and momentum. At just 15, she had already testified before the state legislature, advised on national youth policy, and launched the First Voice initiative into schools across multiple districts. Her blog was now syndicated through several youth advocacy platforms, and local news outlets routinely featured updates about her work. Yet for all the acclaim, Kayla remained deeply focused on one principle: justice without action is just performance. Change had to reach real people in real time. That belief led to the next evolution in her mission. During a leadership panel at a regional education summit, Kayla met a soft-spoken high school junior named Aria Lynn. Aria approached her afterward, clutching a folder full of typed pages and handwritten notes. "Kayla, I've been following your work since the hearings," she said. "But I think what happened to me could be happening to others, and I don't know what to do." Over lunch in the school cafeteria, Aria shared her story. She had applied for a summer internship at a well-known tech company through her school's career prep program. Despite glowing recommendations and a top GPA, she was told she wasn't a good cultural fit. Curious, she requested feedback. Weeks later, a document was accidentally emailed to her. It included coded language and vague concerns about how her background and community context might create a communication mismatch. Kayla felt her stomach turn. It was the same polished prejudice she had faced, but now wrapped in corporate lingo and hidden behind HR speak. She studied the document carefully and told Aria, "You're not alone. And this isn't just about you. It's systemic." Together, they drafted a formal report and submitted it to the school district's equity office. Kayla also contacted her growing network of education attorneys and policy experts, who reviewed the internship program's practices and flagged several civil rights concerns. In the weeks that followed, Kayla and Aria co-authored an op-ed titled, "Qualified but Excluded, When Talent Isn't Enough." It was published in 3 major newspapers and widely shared on social media. Within a month, the tech company in question quietly revised its internship program, and the school district implemented new guidelines requiring transparency in placement decisions. Aria became the second youth ambassador of the First Voice initiative. That experience lit a new fire in Kayla. She realized that while financial access and customer equity were important, the next frontier was opportunity equity, ensuring that young people of color weren't quietly weeded out of internships, scholarships, and career paths by invisible gatekeepers and veiled language. With Naomi's help, Kayla assembled a volunteer team of researchers, educators, and young leaders to study patterns in youth opportunity access. They analyzed over 100 internship programs, reviewed feedback practices, and interviewed dozens of students from marginalized communities. The data was clear: biases didn't vanish once the application was submitted. They simply took on new forms, softer, harder to trace, but no less damaging. In response, Kayla drafted what she called the Transparent Pathways Framework, a policy model that outlined fair access principles for youth development programs. It included requirements like anonymous scoring systems, applicant audit trails, equity-based interview training, and optional student advocates for first-generation applicants. Naomi pitched the proposal to the State Education Board, and it was adopted as a pilot across 5 counties. Kayla presented the findings in October at the American Youth Policy Council's National Conference. Standing behind the podium in a ballroom filled with leaders twice her age, she made her case with clarity and conviction. "Denying opportunity doesn't always look like a slammed door," she said. "Sometimes, it's a smile and a quiet file labeled, 'Not the right fit.' If we want an equitable future, we need to do more than open the door. We need to light the hallway." The speech earned her a standing ovation and a wave of invitations to expand the program nationally. But perhaps her most impactful moment came not from a stage, but from a classroom. In late October, Kayla visited a middle school in a rural part of the state where the First Voice initiative had recently been implemented. The school served a diverse student population, many of whom came from working-class families and had never been exposed to civic education or financial literacy beyond the basics. The principal, Mrs. Alvarez, had reached out weeks earlier, writing, "Our kids are smart, but they don't know what they don't know. We need voices like yours to show them what's possible." Kayla spent a full day at the school. She met with students in small groups, led workshops on goal setting and self-advocacy, and shared parts of her journey, especially the moments of doubt and fear that came before the strength. During the final session, a boy named Malik raised his hand. "How did you know they were wrong about you?" he asked. "Like, when they made you feel small. How did you not believe them?" Kayla paused. Her eyes softened. "Because I had people in my life who reminded me who I was," she said. "And when their voices weren't enough, I had to become my own reminder. That's why I carry this." She held up her notebook, the one she had used that day at Oak Bank. "This is where I recorded what happened. Not just so others would believe me, but so I wouldn't forget to believe in myself." After the session, Malik approached her privately. "I think I want to start a notebook too," he said shyly. Kayla smiled and reached into her bag. She pulled out a brand new leather-bound journal, the same kind she'd used. "Start with your truth," she said. "And keep writing until the world hears it." That evening, as she rode back home with Naomi, Kayla looked out the window at the changing leaves. "Sometimes I wonder if all this started because of that one check," she said quietly. Naomi glanced over. "It did. But it kept going because you decided not to let it stop there." As fall deepened, so did the reach of Kayla's work. She developed a digital platform for the First Voice initiative, complete with interactive modules, video mentorship series, and anonymous reporting tools for students who face discrimination in academic or professional settings. The platform gained 50,000 users in its first month, and partnerships were established with 3 state school systems. At the same time, Kayla's name was quietly submitted for the National Youth Impact Award, a prestigious recognition given to one student each year who had demonstrated extraordinary leadership in advancing justice and equity. Naomi kept the nomination a surprise. On a cold November evening, at a formal banquet held in downtown Atlanta, Kayla sat among dozens of student leaders, unaware that the final award of the night was meant for her. As the presenter described the honoree, a young woman who took her pain and turned it into power, who exposed injustice and built blueprints for change, Kayla began to realize. When her name was called, the room erupted in applause. Kayla rose slowly, her breath catching, and walked to the stage. She accepted the award with grace, then turned to the microphone. "This award doesn't just belong to me," she said. "It belongs to every young person who's ever been told they were too young to lead, too quiet to be heard, too different to belong. We are not the future, we are the present. And we are ready." The applause didn't stop for a long time. That night, back in her hotel room, Kayla sat cross-legged on the bed, trophy beside her, notebook in hand. She wrote a single line across the top of a fresh page. "When one voice rises, others follow. But when that voice makes space for more, it becomes a movement." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether more challenges, more victories, or something in between. But she knew this: she wasn't just making history. She was making space. And she would never stop. Kayla Thompson's journey reminds us that real change often begins in the quiet moments, when someone chooses to speak up instead of staying silent. Whether you're 14 or 64, your voice has power. Her story teaches us that dignity, truth, and perseverance can challenge even the most entrenched systems. It's not about being loud, it's about being clear, prepared, and courageous, even when the world tries to dismiss you. In your own life, whether you're at a bank, a school, or your workplace, remember, your story matters. Stand tall. Write it down. Share it. And never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. If Kayla's story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment sharing what part resonated with you the most. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to Life's Hidden Gems, where everyday courage becomes unforgettable.